man in the hoodie? It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon at the downtown Los Angeles branch of Heritage National Bank. The air inside the lobby was cool and crisp, carrying the sterile scent of paperwork, cologne, and freshly cleaned tile floors. Behind the polished counter stood a row of clerks in suits, smiles plastered on their faces, fingers flying across keyboards. They had no idea that their world was about to be flipped upside down. Keanu Reeves walked through the front doors, wearing a faded gray hoodie and jeans that looked a little too worn for someone of his reputation. His beard was slightly overgrown, and he kept his head down as if trying not to draw attention to himself. In his hand was a simple bank envelope. No entourage, no cameras, no fuss. Just a man who needed to make a transaction. He stood in line, like everyone else, behind a young woman cradling a baby, and ahead of an older man who kept tapping his foot impatiently. Nobody gave him a second glance, and that was fine by him. He liked moments like these, simple, normal, peaceful. When it was his turn, he stepped forward and greeted the teller with a soft smile. "Hi," he said kindly. "I'd like to make a withdrawal." The teller, a young man named Curtis, barely looked up. "I'd account number and withdrawal slip, please," he said in a rehearsed tone, eyes still on the screen in front of him. Keanu handed over everything silently. Curtis looked at the name on the slip, then glanced at the ID. "Keanu Reeves?" he said with a skeptical chuckle. "You're kidding, right?" Keanu gave a small nod. "No joke." Curtis leaned back and looked him up and down. The hoodie, the worn shoes, the quiet demeanor. He didn't look like a millionaire, let alone a man with business ties that reached across the globe. "One moment," Curtis said, typing something into his terminal. He frowned, then typed again. His brows pulled tighter. "This can't be right," he muttered under his breath. He turned to his supervisor, a sharp-dressed woman named Evelyn who was sipping her third coffee of the day. "Hey, Evelyn, this guy's trying to withdraw a ridiculous amount. Claims he's Keanu Reeves." Evelyn looked up. Her eyes landed on Keanu. She laughed. "Him? No way." "Should we call security?" Curtis whispered. Keanu heard it. His face remained calm, but inside he felt a wave of disappointment. Not because they didn't recognize him, but because once again he was being judged by appearance. "Sir," Evelyn said as she walked over, "we're going to need to verify this account. Can you step aside?" Keanu did as asked. He watched quietly as Curtis and Evelyn whispered, shook their heads, and typed furiously. The people in line began to murmur. One man muttered, "He looks homeless." A woman whispered to her friend, "Maybe he's trying to scam the bank." Keanu stood there in silence. After several minutes, Evelyn returned with a forced smile. "Sir, unfortunately, we can't process this withdrawal at this time. The account is locked for suspicious activity." Keanu tilted his head. "That's strange. I used it 2 days ago." "Well, that's not our concern. Unless you can prove, beyond this ID, that you are who you say you are, we'll have to ask you to leave." Her tone had shifted. It wasn't professional anymore. It was condescending. Keanu nodded slowly. "I understand," he said gently. "But I really need that money. It's not for me, it's for a donation. There's a shelter that needs to cover their month's rent by 5 p.m. today or they'll lose the building." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Sir, I don't know what kind of act you're putting on, but it won't work here." Curtis added, "You can try another branch or come back tomorrow, maybe with a lawyer or a real ID." People in the lobby had begun watching. A few even took out their phones, but none of them knew what was really happening. Keanu sighed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He had learned long ago that money changes how people look at you. So did fame. But humility? Humility confused people. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He made one quiet call. "Hi, Emily," he said. "Yes, it happened again. Could you please call David? Have him meet me here in 10 minutes. Evelyn rolled her eyes. "Calling backup now?" "Not backup," Keanu replied calmly. "Just the chairman of the board." Curtis laughed out loud. "The chairman? Of this bank? You think the chairman is going to drop everything to meet you?" Keanu smiled and said nothing. Exactly 9 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up outside. A tall man in a navy suit stepped out, flanked by 2 others. The glass doors slid open and the whole lobby turned to look. "Mr. Reeves," the man said loudly. "So sorry for the delay. I came as fast as I could." Gasps filled the room. Curtis went pale. Evelyn froze. The man in the suit walked directly up to Keanu and extended his hand. "David Langston, chairman of Heritage National Bank. How can I help you today?" "Just came to make a small withdrawal," Keanu said softly. "Absolutely," David said. "And on behalf of the bank, I apologize for the way you've been treated. It won't happen again." Keanu nodded politely. David turned to Evelyn and Curtis. "Office, now." They followed him, stunned and silent. The room buzzed with energy. Customers stared. One elderly woman whispered, "I knew it was him." Another said, "That poor man. He was just trying to help someone." The young woman with the baby stepped forward. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trying to help that shelter." Keanu gave her a warm smile. Everyone deserves a roof over their head. The staff was silent as Keanu finished his transaction, handled now by the bank's senior executive who had been urgently called in from upstairs. Every bill was counted twice, every document stamped with care. As Keanu stepped outside, people gathered near the door, not to ask for photos but to say thank you. One man said, "I'm sorry they treated you like that." Another woman said, "They didn't deserve you." Keanu looked at them and replied, "I'm not here to be treated special, just here to do something that matters." He got into the car and drove straight to the shelter, but back at the bank, the fallout was only just beginning. The shelter and the storm. Keanu Reeves didn't say much on the way to the shelter. The car hummed gently along the quiet streets of Los Angeles while raindrops began to patter against the windshield. The city was slowing down. But for Keanu, things were just getting started. He sat in the back seat with the donation envelope in his hand. It wasn't just money. It was hope, warmth, and maybe the only reason 50 families wouldn't be out on the streets that night. He had promised the shelter director, Maria, that he would help. And Keanu never broke a promise. When the car pulled up in front of the building, the scene broke his heart. Maria stood outside in the cold rain with a clipboard arguing with a man in a suit. Behind her, volunteers were trying to calm mothers holding babies, elderly men with worn jackets and teenagers with tired eyes. There were suitcases lined against the walls, bags of personal belongings soaked through. The city official had already arrived with an eviction notice. Keanu stepped out of the car and walked straight through the rain without an umbrella. His hoodie clung to his shoulders, but he didn't care. "Maria," he said gently. She turned around. Her face lit up. "Keanu, oh God, I didn't know if you'd make it." "I promised I would," the man in the suit scoffed. "And you are?" Keanu handed him the sealed envelope. "Someone who believes in these people." The man opened it. His eyes widened. Inside was a certified bank check covering the overdue lease, maintenance, utilities, and a portion of next month's rent. More than enough to cancel the eviction. This is legitimate," he muttered, stunned. Keanu nodded. "So you can walk away now." The man didn't argue. He walked back to his car, still in disbelief. As soon as the official drove off, Maria broke down in tears. She hugged Keanu tightly. "You saved us." One of the little boys, no older than 7, looked up and asked, "Who is he?" Another child whispered, "He's the man from the movies." But Keanu knelt down, smiled, and said, "I'm just someone who cares." The volunteers cheered. Mothers hugged their children. People who had been afraid to hope now had something to hold on to. But back at the bank, storm clouds were gathering, not in the sky, but inside the conference room on the 10th floor. Evelyn sat at the edge of a long glass table, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Curtis sat beside her, pale and sweating. The chairman, David Langston, paced slowly behind them. His voice was calm but heavy with anger. You denied access to one of our largest philanthropic accounts, he said, and you humiliated him publicly. We didn't know it was really him, Evelyn said quickly. He looked, like what? David snapped. Like someone who didn't belong here? Like someone who didn't deserve respect? She went silent. Curtis whispered, We were following protocol. No. You weren't. David cut him off. You let your assumptions guide you, not our values. He placed a file in front of them. Inside were screenshots from social media, video clips posted by customers in the bank that day. The footage had already gone viral. Hashtags like KeanuReeves, humble, dar bank fail, and respect everyone were trending worldwide. News anchors were already picking up the story. David looked them both in the eyes. Effective immediately, Evelyn, you're being relieved of your duties as branch manager. Curtis, you're on indefinite suspension pending review. You can't do that, Evelyn gasped. I already did. Evelyn's face went white. Curtis lowered his head in shame. But it wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability and change. Outside the boardroom, senior leaders were already planning emergency training programs, writing statements of apology, and preparing to do what should have been done long ago. Treat every customer with dignity, no matter what they wore, no matter how they looked. The next morning, Keanu was back at the shelter, not as a celebrity but as a volunteer. He helped serve breakfast. He played chess with an elderly veteran named Frank. He read stories to the children and cleaned out storage, closets. He asked for nothing in return. Maria sat down next to him during lunch and said, You could have just sent the money. Why come in person? Keanu looked around at the smiling faces and said softly, Because money doesn't change lives. People do. The shelter would go on to be fully funded for the next 3 years. An anonymous donor, who everyone suspected, was Keanu, ensured that. But the story didn't stop there. Keanu's quiet kindness had reached far beyond that one building. News outlets began covering the story. Not the gossip kind, but the kind that touched hearts. People around the world saw the viral clip of him standing humbly in that bank lobby, being dismissed, judged, ignored, and then choosing not to lash out, but to quietly do what was right. Interviews poured in, requests for comments. But Keanu declined them all. Instead, he released a short written message that read, Treat everyone with kindness. Not because they're famous, not because they're rich, just because they're human. And across the world, something shifted. At Heritage National Bank, the board launched a new campaign called Every Face Matters, aimed at retraining every employee in empathy and equality. They also announced the creation of the Reeves Fund, which would provide emergency shelter aid in major cities across the country. Meanwhile, Curtis, who had been suspended, found himself thinking deeply about what had happened. He wasn't a bad person, but that day he had let bias blind him. After weeks of reflection, he wrote Keanu a letter. It wasn't public. It wasn't posted. Just a private letter that said, I'm sorry. You taught me something I'll never forget. Keanu received the letter. He smiled and then mailed Curtis something back, a small book, titled Kindness, the Strongest Currency. Inside the cover, Keanu had written just one line, Now you pay it forward. A chain of kindness, 3 weeks passed. In most viral news stories, people move on. Attention shifts, headlines fade, and the world forgets. But something about Keanu Reeves's quiet act of kindness had stayed with people. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. It was real. And that made it unforgettable. Curtis had read the book Keanu sent him twice. Every night before sleeping, he held the last page in his hands, reading that one simple sentence. Now you pay it forward. It stuck in his head. It echoed in his heart. He thought about how quickly he had judged someone based on clothes and appearance, how fast he had dismissed a kind man. He couldn't go back and change that day. But maybe he could change the next one. On a cold Monday morning, Curtis walked into a nearby food bank and asked if they needed volunteers. The woman behind the desk blinked in surprise. We always do, she said. But we don't usually get people like you in a suit. He chuckled awkwardly. It's not who I was. It's who I'm trying to be. He started coming every morning, before job interviews, washing dishes, handing out food, smiling at people who looked like no one had smiled at them in weeks. For the first time in years, Curtis felt something that the bank never gave him. Purpose, and it didn't stop with him. Videos of Keanu at the shelter had reached an inner-city teacher named Mrs. Carter. She showed the video to her 6th grade TO class. They were noisy kids, full of energy, some of them hardened by life too early. When the clip ended, the room was quiet. "Why do you think he helped them?" she asked. A shy girl named Lena raised her hand and said, "Because he didn't care about being important. He cared about doing something important." The next day, Lena and her classmates organized a sock drive for homeless shelters. They called it Warm Hearts, Warm Feet. Within a week, they had collected over 500 pairs of socks. Keanu had no idea any of this was happening. He was back to his usual life, reading scripts, riding his motorcycle, enjoying quiet dinners. But everywhere he went now, strangers approached not to talk about his movies, but to thank him for what he did at the bank. One man in a grocery store said, "My son was about to drop out of college. Then he saw your video. Now he's studying to be a social worker." A woman at a coffee shop said, "You made me believe that not all celebrities forget where they came from." Keanu smiled each time and said the same thing. "It's not about being seen. It's about seeing others." Meanwhile, Evelyn, the former branch manager, had fallen into a deep silence. She had spent years climbing the ladder. For her, authority had meant control, and she hadn't realized how far from humanity she had drifted until the day she was removed. She avoided the news, avoided her friends, until one afternoon her younger sister called. "You need to see this," she said. She sent Evelyn a clip of Keanu talking to a young boy at the shelter. No guards, no cameras. Just a man kneeling beside a child with holes in his shoes, tying his laces and handing him a hot chocolate. Evelyn cried for the first time in years. Then she did something unexpected. She got up, dressed simply, and walked to a public library where they were holding a resume workshop for unemployed adults. She sat at the back of the room, listening, learning. After it ended, she approached the host. "I used to be a manager at a bank," she said. "I made mistakes, but I think I can help people now." The woman smiled and said, "Then you're in the right place." As for the bank itself, Heritage National, its leadership took a rare step. They didn't just fix policies. They changed their culture. They introduced a new rule. Every employee must volunteer 8 hours per month in their local community. They also began hosting monthly kindness awards. Not for sales, not for profits, for compassion. And the first recipient, a janitor named Ray, he had once given his lunch to a homeless man sleeping outside the bank doors, not because someone told him to, but because it was the right thing to do. Keanu wasn't there to receive credit for any of this. He didn't attend the ceremonies. He didn't speak at press conferences. But his name echoed in the halls anyway. Then came the moment that no one expected. One early morning, Keanu received a letter at his home. It was from the CEO of Heritage National Bank, Michael Alden. The man had never met Keanu before, but his words were heartfelt. "Mr. Reeves, you showed us who we were when we weren't looking. You reminded us that money doesn't define worth. Action does. Thank you for holding a mirror to our values. We'd like to meet with you. Not to offer a deal, not to write a check, but to ask for your guidance." Keanu read the letter slowly, then folded it and placed it on the table. He stared out the window for a long time. Later that week, he walked into the bank headquarters, not through the back door or the VIP entrance, but the front like everyone else. No suit, no glasses, just the same hoodie and jeans. And as he walked through the lobby, every single employee stood up and clapped. Not because he was a celebrity, but because he had reminded them how to be human. Keanu nodded politely, smiled, and said one simple thing. "Let's talk about how we can make this permanent." One meeting, many ripples, Keanu Reeves sat at the long boardroom table at Heritage National Bank headquarters. This was the same company that had once questioned his identity, judged his appearance, and humiliated him in public. But now, every seat around that table was filled with people who wanted to listen. And not because he was famous, but because, for the first time in the bank's history, one quiet act of compassion had done more for their reputation than any marketing campaign ever could. Michael Alden, the CEO, cleared his throat. He was a sharp-looking man in his late 50s, dressed in a custom suit, with silver hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of business and too little of humanity. "Mr. Reeves," he said gently, "I want to begin by saying, we failed you. And not just you. We failed everyone who walks into our branches and gets judged before they speak." Keanu gave a small nod. "Thank you. But this isn't about me. It's about what you do next." The room fell quiet. Keanu opened a small notebook and read from it. "You've already launched the Reeves Fund. That's a good start. But I'd like to propose something different. Not for your public image. Not for profits. For people." He looked up and continued. "What if your staff didn't just volunteer because it was required, but because they wanted to? What if you trained them not just in procedure, but in empathy? Real empathy." He leaned forward. "And what if every person who walked through your doors, no matter their clothes, their accent, or their skin color, felt welcome?" Michael looked around the table. No one spoke, but heads nodded slowly. Keanu continued. "I'll fund the first round of training. You don't have to put a cent into it. Just let me bring in people who understand what it means to be invisible, and then give your team a chance to learn from them." Michael hesitated for a second, then said, "Deal. One more thing," Keanu added. "I don't want this to be about my name. Call the program See Them First, because everyone deserves to be seen for who they are before we decide what they're not." The room clapped softly. And with that, the meeting ended. Keanu didn't stay for coffee or photos. He walked out quietly, back into the city that buzzed with noise but often missed the silent cries for help. And as he did, something unexpected happened across the street. A homeless man dropped his bag while crossing the sidewalk. A woman in a business suit rushed to help him pick up the spilled contents. A week ago, she might have walked by, but not today, not after seeing the video. Not after watching someone like Keanu take time for people most ignored. Keanu noticed it and smiled. Meanwhile, back at the food shelter, things were shifting too. Curtis, once the teller who had mocked Keanu, was now organizing his first charity event. It was small, just a weekend drive to collect warm clothing for the winter, but it mattered. He stood before a group of volunteers and said, "Some of you know I used to work at a bank. I thought I was above people like the ones we help here. I judged by appearances. I turned kindness into suspicion. But then a man walked into my life and turned my pride into shame, and then gave me a chance to be better." He paused. "If you've ever made a mistake like mine, don't run from it, grow from it." In another part of the city, Evelyn, the former bank manager, had started helping at a resume clinic every Thursday night. She sat beside struggling fathers, single moms, and young people with no direction. And for once, she wasn't giving orders. She was listening. One evening, a young woman named Jasmine hesitated to speak. Evelyn leaned in and said, "Go ahead. Your words matter here," Jasmine said quietly. "I used to steal. From stores. I'm not proud. But I was hungry. And now, I can't get a job because of my record." Evelyn took her hand and said, "I used to turn people like you away. Not anymore." She helped Jasmine rewrite her resume. She even called a friend who ran a small cafe. Jasmine got the interview. And the job. It wasn't just about Keanu anymore. It was about a movement. At the same time, the shelter Keanu had helped began getting calls from all over the country. A pastor from Chicago said, "We saw what happened in Los Angeles. We want to start something like it here." A teacher in New York said, "My students want to do a kindness campaign. Can we use the name See Them First?" A grandmother in Texas donated 10 quilts she made by hand. In the box, she wrote, I'm 83, I can't do much, but I can sew. One afternoon, Maria from the shelter received a visit. It was Curtis. He came holding a folder. "What's this?" she asked. "A proposal," he said, smiling nervously. "I want to start a microloan program, small loans for families who can't get help from banks, interest-free, just trust-based, like the trust someone gave me." Maria blinked. "You're serious?" He nodded. "We'll call it the Second Chance Fund." As the program grew, reporters once again asked Keanu to speak. They wanted interviews. They wanted sound bites. He agreed to one. It was with a college student journalist named Samira who was writing for a school paper. During the interview, she asked, "Why did you really step in that day at the bank?" Keanu paused for a moment, then said, "Because if I didn't, I would have been just like everyone else who watched and said nothing." She asked, "And what would you say now to the people who treated you poorly?" He looked into the camera and replied, "Thank you." Samira looked confused. "Why thank them?" "Because without them, I wouldn't have seen how many people were watching and waiting for something better." In the weeks that followed, See Them First became more than a training program. It became a philosophy. Schools adopted it. Hospitals printed it on posters. Even airlines trained their crews using its ideas. And Keanu? He just kept showing up. One day, he walked into a high school where kids had raised money for a local shelter. The principal said, "We didn't think you'd come." Keanu smiled and said, "I said I would, and promises matter." He sat with the kids. Not on the stage, not at the front, but on the floor beside them. One of the boys leaned over and asked, "Do you think kindness really changes the world?" Keanu looked around the room, at the smiling faces, the full hearts, the growing hope, and said quietly, "I think it's the only thing that ever has." The unseen heroes, the world had shifted, not because of a grand speech or a staged act, but because one man in a hoodie chose patience over pride. Keanu Reeves never wanted attention for it. Still, what he did at the bank became the match that lit 1,000 quiet fires. And some of those fires began to burn in places no one expected. Deep in a small town outside Nevada, a young single mother named Rachel watched the viral video of Keanu's bank encounter from a cracked phone screen in the back of a grocery store. Her son, Eli, sat beside her, flipping through a comic book someone had left behind. Rachel had been working 2 jobs, barely making rent, and had just gotten rejected for a loan that would have helped her get back to school. Watching Keanu, rich, famous, calm, being treated like a liar just because he looked ordinary, made something rise in her chest. Not anger, not pity, but recognition. If even he can be treated like nothing, she whispered to herself. Maybe I'm not crazy for feeling invisible. The next morning, she walked into the local credit union, not for money, but for a meeting with the branch manager. She held printouts of Keanu's initiative, See Them First, and said, "I want to start something like this here." At first, they were confused, but as she kept speaking, with tears, passion, and hope, they listened. And by the end of the week, that credit union became the first small-town branch in America to join the program. Rachel got her school grant 2 months later. Back in Los Angeles, Maria's shelter was overflowing, not with problems, but with solutions. Food deliveries doubled. Volunteers signed up daily. Donations poured in from people who never would have noticed the shelter before. Maria sat at her desk late one night and looked through letters she'd received. One came from an 11-year-old girl named Sophia. "Dear Maria, I saw Mr. Reeves help the shelter and it made me want to help too. I raised $22 with my lemonade stand. Please give it to a kid who doesn't have a bed. Love, Sophia." Maria cried. $22 may not have seemed like much, but it was everything. It was a child saying, "I see you." Curtis, now completely transformed from bank teller to community organizer, was preparing for the launch of the Second Chance Fund. He had worked with Maria, local lawyers, and even former clients from the bank who had once been turned away. One of them was Mr. Campos, a retired electrician who'd been denied credit after falling behind on hospital bills. When Curtis approached him to be part of the new panel reviewing microloan requests, Mr. Campos said, "Me? But I'm not a banker." "You're better," Curtis said. "You're human." They approved the first microloan for a young woman, trying to open a mobile haircut service for elderly patients who couldn't leave home. Her name was Carla. She cried when she got the news. Meanwhile, Evelyn, once the icy bank manager, was organizing her own redemption behind the scenes. She had started writing to women in prison. It began with one letter to a mother who had been arrested for shoplifting diapers. That woman wrote back and then others followed. Evelyn realized something important. While she couldn't undo the past, she could stop pretending it didn't matter. She started teaching workshops in correctional facilities, how to prepare for job interviews, how to manage money, how to believe that one mistake didn't define a lifetime. And every session, she began with the same story, how she judged a man in a hoodie, and how that man changed everything. Keanu, however, had gone quiet again, not silent, just quiet. He returned to his bike rides, his small film projects, and reading books at the park. He never once posted about the movement he started. He never claimed ownership. Because to him, real change didn't need credit, it needed consistency. One day, while walking through a small bookstore, a teenage boy approached him. "Are you him?" the boy asked. "The guy from the bank?" Keanu nodded. The boy looked down and said, "My dad works construction. People treat him like dirt sometimes. He saw your story and cried. I've never seen him cry before." Keanu placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Tell him thank you. People like your dad build the world." Meanwhile, the bank's transformation was in full bloom. Heritage National had now installed kindness desks at all branches. Customers with disabilities, language barriers, or emotional struggles could speak to specially trained team members, people hired for compassion first, not credentials. They also began tracking impact stories instead of just profit reports. And one story kept popping up. A man named Ray. Yes, the janitor. Ray had become a legend inside the company. Not because of his cleaning, but because he had started mentoring new hires, teaching them not just where the supply closet was, but how to treat people with dignity. One day, an executive visited Ray at lunch and said, "You've changed this place." Ray wiped his hands on a napkin and smiled. "I didn't change it. Someone just reminded us how to be decent again." On the anniversary of the shelter's rebirth, Maria hosted a celebration. Children sang songs, families shared stories, volunteers hugged. Curtis gave a short speech. Even Evelyn showed up and brought 10 job applications from women re-entering society. But the most touching moment came when Maria handed the microphone to a small girl named Anaya. Anaya had once been homeless. Now she stood tall in her new school uniform, holding a hand-drawn sign that said, "Thank you for seeing me." Then she said into the mic, "If you hadn't helped us, we wouldn't be here, so I want to help next. When I grow up, I'll build a house for kids like me." The crowd wiped away tears. Then a quiet voice from the back said, "You won't have to wait that long." Everyone turned. Keanu was standing there. He stepped forward and knelt beside Anaya. "How about we build one together?" The audience erupted. But even then, Keanu stayed grounded. He didn't stand on stage. He didn't give a long speech. He just held Anaya's hand and said, "You reminded me what matters." As the night ended, Maria stood with Keanu under the stars. "You know," she said, "you could have just wired the money that day and disappeared." Keanu looked at the shelter behind them, glowing with laughter and hope. "I thought about it," he said, "but then I realized the world doesn't change through money. It changes when someone decides not to walk away. One spark, one world." The shelter that once faced eviction now stood like a light in the dark. Fresh paint on the walls, clean beds for every child, stocked shelves in the kitchen, and laughter that never stopped. No one there called it Keanu Reeves's shelter. They called it home. And maybe that was the best part. But the change didn't stop at the city line. The See Them First initiative had quietly spread to cities across the country, and even internationally. without flashy billboards or celebrity endorsements. It moved through classrooms, churches, cafes, and corners of society that usually didn't get attention. Not because people were told to follow it, but because they felt it. And it all began because one man walked into a bank in a hoodie. Keanu never expected his story to go that far. He was back on set, filming a small independent movie in New Orleans. The director was new, the cast young, and the budget tight. But he smiled every day on set because he knew, while he told fictional stories on camera, something very real was unfolding out in the world. One day between takes, a quiet sound technician approached him with nervous eyes. "Mr. Reeves," she whispered, "my mom got her first job because of your program." Keanu looked up. She was in prison for 10 years. No one wanted to give her a chance, but a banker who took the See Them First training, he gave her one. She's working at a bakery now. She wakes up at 5 a.m. every day, and she smiles. Keanu stood up, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "Tell her I said thank you." Back in Los Angeles, Curtis's Second Chance Fund had grown into something he never imagined. What began with one small loan had become hundreds. Mothers opening food carts, veterans starting handyman services, teenagers selling handmade crafts online. Every repayment went into helping the next person. Not one person defaulted. They didn't just borrow money, they borrowed belief. And Curtis, he was no longer seen as the man who denied Keanu Reeves at the counter. He was the man who took his own mistake and turned it into a lifeline for others. One afternoon, while reviewing applications, he saw a familiar name, Mr. Campos. The retired electrician had applied not for himself, but for his granddaughter. She wanted to study robotics. The note said, "She has a mind that builds things. She just needs a door to open." Curtis smiled and approved the loan instantly. Evelyn, too, had changed in a way few could have predicted. She no longer wore expensive suits or spoke with cold detachment. Now, she stood on stage in front of college students and told the story of how she lost everything, position, pride, and ego, because she couldn't see the man in front of her. He didn't scream, she told them. He didn't threaten. He simply chose to be better than me. Then she paused and added softly, "And now, I try to be better than who I was yesterday." Evelyn had started a nonprofit focused on fair hiring for people with criminal records. She called it Second Windows because, as she said, sometimes the door slams in your face, but that doesn't mean the house is closed. The bank itself, Heritage National, had become an unexpected leader in empathy training. Their branches weren't just places to handle money. They became local support centers. They even started an annual scholarship called the Reeves Honor, awarded to students who demonstrated exceptional compassion in their communities. And during the very first award ceremony, Keanu was invited as a guest of honor. He almost didn't go. But Maria called him the night before and said, "You've inspired a generation. They should see the face of the man who taught the world to listen." So he went. The stage was simple. No gold, no lights. Just a wooden platform in a school auditorium filled with families, teachers, and teary-eyed kids. The scholarship winner was a teenage boy named Noah, who had started a silent lunch club where kids with social anxiety could eat without pressure, surrounded by understanding friends. Noah walked up nervously and said into the mic, "I saw the video of you at the bank, the one where they didn't believe who you were. And you didn't yell, you didn't fight. You just stayed kind. That gave me courage." He turned to Keanu and added, "Thank you for showing me that being quiet doesn't mean being weak." The crowd clapped. Keanu stood slowly, walked to Noah and hugged him. Then he finally spoke. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about what you choose to do when no one's watching. When you have the power to judge or the power to understand. I didn't come here to be celebrated. I came here to celebrate all of you." The room stood in a standing ovation, and still, Keanu didn't linger. After the event, he stepped outside, breathing in the cool air, heart full. A woman from the audience followed him. She looked nervous. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "my son has autism. He doesn't speak much. But when he saw you in that hoodie, at the bank..." He smiled. He pointed at the screen and said his first sentence in months. Keanu froze. He said, she continued, voice trembling, "That man is good." Tears filled his eyes. He didn't reply. He simply hugged her, holding that moment like a fragile gift. Somewhere far away, another story was beginning. A girl in a village in India, who had never even seen a Keanu Reeves movie, watched a dubbed clip of his story on a shared phone. She turned to her father and said, "Can I help too?" He smiled and handed her a notebook. "Start with your name," he said, "and then write who you want to help." Because in the end, the story wasn't about a bank. It wasn't about fame. It was about seeing the unseen. It was about kindness that echoes through broken systems, through closed doors, through tired hearts, and finds a way to open them, one person at a time. And long after the cameras stopped rolling, long after the headlines faded, Keanu Reeves continued walking into places where no one expected him, and leaving behind something more powerful than money or fame: hope.